The program for public discourse, as you know, strives to foster constructive dialogue and debate around some of the most challenging and pressing issues facing Carolina and beyond. And tonight is no exception as we tackle the issue of abortion through the theme of faith and abortion. And so the program for public discourse is proud to host some of the brightest and thoughtful minds speaking today on this issue. Maharat Ruth Friedman is a member of the inaugural class of Yeshivat Maharat, which is the first institution to ordain Orthodox women as spiritual leaders. She serves as clergy at Ohev Sholom, the National Synagogue in Washington, D.C., where she performs all traditional rabbinic functions. Lauren Reliford uses her advanced degree in social work and expertise in public and population health to bridge the gap between social theory, spirituality, research, and practice. She currently serves as political director for Sojourners, an ecumenical Christian organization that seeks to discover the intersection of faith, politics, and culture. Leah Sargeant is the author of Arriving at Amen and Building the Benedict Option. She is a convert from atheism to Catholicism, whose writing has appeared in the New York Times and First Things, among other outlets. She is also the chief of staff of debate and public discourse at Braver Angels, an organization that utilizes public discourse to help depolarize America. Our moderator, Maharat Buchbinder, is vice chair of the Department of Social Science and the UNC School of Medicine. She is also adjunct professor of anthropology and the author of several books, including Scripting Death, Stories of Assisted Dying in America. Thanks again to our panelists for their willingness to share their wisdom with us and model constructive dialogue on such a contentious issue.
Before we begin, I'd like to provide a bit of background to help set the stage for our conversation this evening. On June 24th, 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a landmark decision in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization. The Dobbs decision overturned the constitutional right to an abortion established by Roe v. Wade in 1973 and permitted individual states to severely restrict abortion or ban it outright. In the ensuing weeks and months, 14 states enacted legislation that prohibits abortion with and without limited exceptions. In North Carolina, abortion currently remains legal up to 20 weeks. The New York Times reported on March 4th that North Carolina has had a 37% rise in abortions since the Dobbs decision was issued due to a large influx of patients traveling here from other states in the South. This is an evolving issue. North Carolina Republican legislative leaders are reported to have discussed bans at 6 or 13 weeks. Meanwhile, North Carolina healthcare providers have strongly advocated against additional restrictions in order to protect patients' health and safety. Regardless of your views on abortion, we are living in a high-stakes time due to the uncertain legal landscape. For many, this is also a very scary time, as rights to bodily autonomy for a major sector of our population hang in the balance. So why are we here tonight? Many might say that we shouldn't be having a conversation about faith and abortion right now. In fact, some of my colleagues and friends did say so in the weeks leading up to this panel. Their concern is that we don't have the luxury of debating competing ethical frameworks in a time when the law itself is under siege. I very much understand and acknowledge this perspective. But given our pluralist and increasingly polarizing society, I also think that it's now more important than ever to understand the complex relationships between faith, politics, and culture in the United States. The relationship between religion and views on abortion is nuanced. On the one hand, Gallup polls demonstrate a strong correlation between religiosity and views on abortion. About 10% of Americans who seldom or never attend religious services say that abortion should be illegal in all circumstances. This number jumps to 19 to 23% among those who attend once a month or almost every week, and to 40% among those who attend services weekly. These numbers look similar for the percentage of Americans who think abortion is morally wrong. The point here is that how religious Americans are is more predictive of their views on abortion than is their religious identity more generally. On the other hand, these trends are driven primarily by the three largest religious subgroups in the US today: Protestants, Christians, and people who claim no religious identity at all. Public narratives that frame the anti-abortion movement as a religious one and reproductive rights movements as secular overlook our country's religious pluralism, as well as a long history of religious activism to expand access to abortion. In fact, religious leaders have filed multiple lawsuits in recent months opposing restrictive abortion legislation. These are some of the nuanced perspectives that I hope we'll explore tonight. To be clear, we're not here to debate the legality of abortion. We're here to listen to the perspectives from three engaged and reflective people who have spent a lot of time considering these issues and have come to different conclusions. And we're here, I hope, to learn something new and perhaps to have some of our preconceived ideas challenged in some way. We don't often get the opportunity to do this and get beyond the media sound bites, particularly when it comes to abortion. I want to note as well that tonight's discussion will offer a necessarily limited snapshot of faith in abortion. There are many positions left out of this panel, including religious views outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition, as well as more secular views. This is just one of many conversations about abortion happening on and off campus, and I hope that you'll be a part of others taking place this year. Before we get started, I want to let everyone know that we'll be answering audience questions around 6:30 p.m. If you're online, you can start submitting them as early as you like using Zoom's Q&A tool. For people in our audience, a note card can be found at your seat. Please feel free to write your questions down and a staff member will collect them later in the program. So with that, I'd like to begin our conversation by asking each of our panelists to please tell us a little bit about your background and how your faith informs your thinking on abortion. And I think we can start with Leah and then go down the line.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing me out here. And it's really been a pleasure to meet my fellow panelists in our chats prior to this event. I grew up as an atheist, a pro-choice atheist on Long Island. And I grew up not knowing any pro-lifers as individuals. I knew them as a political force and as people who were on TV. And I imagine some of you are here tonight with the same perspective that I had growing up, which is that the pro-life movement is primarily about policing women and sexuality, not about advocating for babies. That was the perspective I had until college when I met people who were pro-life. And as much as I disagreed with them about the moral valence of a child in utero, I trusted that they were in good faith in their arguments. I believed that we really disagreed on the matter and they weren't doing this instrumentally. Over time, in arguments with them, in other kinds of arguments, I eventually became Catholic, assenting to the church's position on the legality and permissibility of abortion. But that kind of was the beginning of my changing view on it, where for me, a lot of this turns around how we respond to the people who are most vulnerable and most needy. And I don't see abortion as a different issue than how we care for the elderly, how we care for the disabled, how we care for the poor. But I see it as part and parcel with how we respond to people whose need makes us fear them, especially when we're afraid we can't meet their need. And then we're tempted to get rid of the person to escape the burden of their need.
Sorry, I just had to sit with that. And I hope you guys can hear me because I don't need to brown nose. My nose is already brown enough. So I just really appreciate what you said. Lauren Reliford, social worker, political director. And I too am a Catholic, but I like to joke that I'm more of a Pope John Paul Catholic than like a PJP2 Catholic or a Benedict Catholic, and that I tend to be a lot more progressive in my views. And I am probably not in line with the church on a lot of things. But I think part of that is also because I grew up in a single family home. My parents were divorced. And so coming from a divorced household, you already are on the outsides of the church. There were often times when my family was often not welcome in churches because it was clear that this woman is here with her 2 kids and no man, so where is she? And so I think some of my position on, I will say that my position on the choice of having an abortion, because I'm not pro-abortion in any way, shape, or form, didn't really start to form until I was actually in middle school or high school, because that was not an issue that we really spoke about when it came to faith. My faith was more focused on, and growing my faith growing up was more focused on what it meant to actually be a Christian and how that you as a Christian are then responsible to others. So I would say that at least my responsibility to another individual and their ability to thrive, not just survive, but really thrive is sort of couched in that theological framework. And then once I started having these debates in middle school, because I found myself in audiences where those things were happening. I went to high school with George Bush's niece. So that's sort of the George Bush, the president. I just realized I feel really old. I don't know how many of you guys remember the Bush 2 years or the Bush 1 year.
It's in the news. It's the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War.
Someone the other day was like, oh, you were born in the 1900s. Don't ever do that to me. Ever again. Ever again. And so I would say that when it comes to my understanding of abortion, I'm really more focused on the choice and how sacred and difficult that choice is. Because whether you decide to have an abortion, whether you decide to adopt, or whether you decide to keep, ultimately, there's still a life that we're talking about. And it's not just the life of a child, it's the life of a mother. And so I think what I really get stuck in the abortion debate is it really just focuses on the baby without focusing on the parent, the mother, the birthing person, and whether she's going to have the resources after the baby is born to make sure that that child can then thrive, especially those first 0 to 3. So I'm really excited to hear from both of you guys, and thank you guys so much for having me. And I also wanted to say, I know today is the beginning of Ramadan, so Ramadan Mubarak, and I'm very excited for folks to be able to break fast and eat after this. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruth. First of all, can you hear me okay? So I should start with, so I am the rabbi at an Orthodox Jewish synagogue, and we tend to be sort of like a broad overgeneralization of the spectrum of Jewish practice, the most small c conservative, and so we don't use electricity on the Sabbath. So I'm actually have no experience using a microphone, and so I might be shouting into a microphone because I'm used to just shouting. So just give me a little nudge if I'm being awkward. Anyway, so yeah, like I said, I'm a member of I was in the first graduating class, let's say that, of a program to train Orthodox Jewish women to be rabbis in communities in a variety of capacities. Until that point, women did not serve in religious leadership roles like that, weren't rabbis of synagogues or other roles, because it's a very traditional part of Judaism, and that was just considered one of the traditional components. There's much more going on there. In terms of how faith informs my views on abortion, the answer is yes and no. And I say that because I grew up in Evanston, Illinois, home of Northwestern University, raised always in very liberal politically areas by some very strong feminists who, the way generations shake out, like Roe Wade was really just considered like a massive accomplishment, and something that if you threaten that, that's like the worst thing you could possibly do. And so it was certainly, I think, raised, and frankly, it's still in my blood, that abortion is a sacred right that no one should take away. Now, that's kind of just like how I was raised as a person. Now, how does faith come into that? So one of the reasons I'm really excited to be here tonight is because I think that as you said, we might often group different religions, religious members of different religions together, but the perspectives really are quite different. Judaism, Jewish law certainly does not. Abortion is permitted under many, many circumstances, and so I would say, in terms of how faith I'll speak more about this later, but about how faith informs my views on abortion. It's partially like Jewish thought on this, but frankly, it's also being a religious minority in America, where I really believe in, preserving our right. By our, I mean the Jewish right, of course, everyone else's too. But if our religion dictates that abortion is permitted under many circumstances, that's something that I feel should be protected for us and therefore for everybody.
Thank you. I guess one thing I want to sort of pick up on, there are so many threads here that I want to pull through, but Leah started to talk a little bit about how you thought the pro-life movement was misunderstood.
How I specifically misunderstood it, it's fair to say.
How you as a person misunderstood it. I'm curious, Ruth and Lauren as well, if you have thoughts about how your own faith community's views have been misunderstood on this issue.
I can, I think quickly, I think one, there's just a lack of recognition of the diversity of thought around the issue of abortion within Christian communities in general. I think even amongst Catholics, like there's literally a whole group called Catholics for Choice. And right around the Dobbs decision, they were projecting images on the Basilica, which is one of the largest Catholic buildings in the country. So it's very visible. And I think that that is just one thing that I want to dispel the myth, is that there's diversity of thought and diversity of understanding within Christian communities. But then I think also just decoupling this notion that if you are not pro-life, you're somehow pro-abortion and you are somehow anti-life. I think that just does a huge disservice to our ability to have a discussion, not even a debate, right? Because when you say debate, you automatically assume y'all are going to go head to head. Just have a discussion about what it means to go through that process. And I think also just who is for life, right? I think that a lot of people who are pro-choice, again, aren't pro-abortion, but they're looking at not just the life of the child, but they're looking at the life of the mother and understanding that that decision is a lot more complex than just saying, you know, looking at it from a deontological position, but they understand that there's sort of this other third gray murky area. And so that is the one thing that I'm really hoping that we can do as we move forward, is one, just sort of decouple this notion that, you know, this is the Christian position, or even this is the Catholic position on that. And then also decouple this notion that if you are not pro-life, that you somehow hate babies and hate children, and you don't have the same concerns about life and the same passion for and desire to ensure that all people thrive. And so that's a purely public policy standpoint as well, because you get that, you go in there and they automatically assume that. And so that becomes very difficult to make any headway when you're trying to have a discussion on these issues.
My sense is that within the public sphere, there would be a strong narrative that Jews, and they say just plain Jews, are pro-choice, let's say, even though I agree, I can't stand these terms. They're just so bad. But however, and because there's a lot of like activism from the more, let's say, left-wing groups within Judaism, there's a lot of pro-choice activism, et cetera. I do think, and I have no idea like how far this spreads, but that within Orthodox Judaism, the narrative as of late has, I should say somehow, but I'll explain how I think how, become that Jews are, let's say, again, pro-life, more in alignment with some Christian groups. And the reason, and I'm not just the only person who thinks this, I've heard other, people speculate this as well, is that in the past, let's say like 20 years or so, the Orthodox Jewish community has been aligning itself more and more with the Republican Party and different groups within, like, let's say, I said this on our introductory call, forgive me, like the Christian right, which I know is a complete overgeneralization, but the sense that group that also, by the way, is very supportive of Israel. And I think that the communities therefore have often found themselves working together in the political sphere and aligning more and more. And I think part of that what's happened is that certain voices within that group, Jewish voices, Orthodox Jewish voices, have started to voice opinions that are more in line with what you might hear in a more traditional pro-life position. And frankly, there are many Orthodox Jews who we're looking at and we're seeing what they're saying. Oh, that Judaism is absolutely anti-abortion. We're totally pro-life under all circumstances, et cetera. And we're like, what? I have no idea where you got that or what you're talking about, right? It's frankly mystifying. And I've heard that from very well-known, very, very knowledgeable rabbis. I've never sat down and talked to them because I don't know them personally, but I cannot understand where they're coming from other than sort of wanting to, I think, kind of romanticize and align the relationship between these two communities as much as possible. And so I don't know how many people follow that ultimately, but to me, it's very important to be a voice of saying, actually, no, even within the most religious areas of Judaism, being the Orthodox, though that's a broad label within itself, there are absolutely many times that abortion is allowed and even sometimes mandated.
And I'll throw out one other kind of confusion that I think obstructs our ability to have a productive conversation, which is I think many Americans on both sides of the issue are deeply confused about what the state of the law is. So, for example, Dobbs didn't overturn Roe, it overturned Casey. Casey had already supplanted Roe by the time, Dobbs had come around. And we've moved over time in terms of what the law of abortion law in the US is, from Roe's trimester framework of no abortions in the third trimester, mostly. Some abortions permissible in the no abortions in the third trimester, some permitted in the second trimester, mostly permitted to make abortion restrictions, not permitted to make abortion restrictions in the first trimester. To Casey, which established the viability standard that people now kind of translate backwards to Roe. So Casey said, before viability, it's all right to make a number of restrictions. After viability, more restrictions are open, but they can't place an undue burden. Casey didn't define what an undue burden was, which has left kind of that barrage of cases coming back and back to the court, because Casey established a standard that no one could quite articulate what it meant. After all, the point of the restrictions was to burden someone. So at what point, how many discouraged or non-permitted abortions became an undue burden? And the viability line itself kind of became a moving target, where with every medical advance, the viability line moved backwards. So over the past 60 or 70 years, we've gone from JFK losing his son when he was delivered early, around 34, 32 weeks, to a point where every doctor would expect, with no other complicating factor, to be able to save that baby now, to the point where, about a quarter of children who are born at 22 weeks survive. But having viability be the governing standard from Casey up till now has left people in an awkward position where every medical advance that could save a wanted baby is a setback for the pro-choice movement.
So I see we've kind of gotten into the thick of the policy discussion, which is great. But I want to maybe take a step back from some of the specifics that you're getting into here, Leah, and just sort of ask more generally, to what extent do you all think that that faith should inform public policy?
Well, as someone whose job is to inform public policy from a faith framework, I guess I'll be the first one to take a swing at that. For me, when I talk about faith, I'm talking about an ethical, moral, values-based framework. And so I think if it's not faith, then it needs to be something grounded in some common morality, which I believe that we have regardless of faith, regardless of belief systems, because you can still be an atheist and be a good person. You can still be, a flying spaghetti monster Rastafarian and still do good things. And so I think that there are just some core human values that can translate outside of faith. I think from at least my Christian faith perspective, I think what we add to public policy is hopefully this respect for life, and really not just life, but really going to those that are the most needy, the most vulnerable, the consistently disenfranchised, and the unintentionally underinvested communities. And that is where our faith says, those are the people that you're supposed to go to, right? My faith is very clear. I believe my faith is very clear about when one suffers, we all suffer. When one rejoices, we all share in the joy. And so to the extent to which you can then translate to public policy that focuses more on the lived experiences, the everyday experiences of human beings, and is crafted in a way that honors their inherent dignity and worth, their God-given inherent dignity and worth, that to me is at least the core of how faith informs politics. But I think there should also be a distinction between faith and religion, because I think oftentimes people assume that faith is attached to a particular denomination or an institution, and that's not. And so I also want to be very clear that when I talk about faith, I'm talking about my own spiritual understanding of Christianity, not my Catholic understanding of Christianity, not not any other piece. And so from there, I think it is a really great way to influence policy, because that is just our sort of theory of understanding of humanity and how we tend to it. And then we hope that policy is reflective of that, but without adopting, Catholic teaching or, Protestant teaching. So.
Religion makes a truth claim about the world, the same way as science does, the same way as philosophy does. And each discipline uses different methods to try and sift through which truth claims are correct and which ones are false. we disagree somewhat about what Catholicism claims and what it compels us. And the one guarantee is we can't both be right. At least one of us is wrong, and it's possible we're both in error. And the goal is for us to live fully in the truth and for our difference to be a spur, especially the more we like each other. To kind of sift the difference and try and get to the heart, and for one or both of us to be converted to live more fully in the truth. Politics forces us to confront differences in beliefs about what's true in the world that we might otherwise slip by, because it gives our neighbor power over us. And that forces us not just to kind of give ourselves fully over to a live and let live libertarianism, but a certain kind of caution, love, fear that, when my neighbor votes and when my neighbor disagrees with me out in the world, I can't just say, well, they can raise their children however they want. Everyone makes their own choice. They're affecting how I raise my children. And when that goes badly, we have intense fear, division, hatred of each other. But the best thing America can do is force many different claims in the world into civil discussion with each other. We don't do it well all the time. But politics is informed by religion the same way it's informed by philosophy. That during COVID, when hospitals were making decisions about who to put on ventilators, whether to make them first come, first serve, whether to ration them on the basis of age, whether to disqualify the disabled from receiving help when hospital administrators felt their quality of life was lower than someone without a disability and therefore less worth saving when they couldn't save everyone. That's a debate about religion and philosophy, and it's not solely a matter of taste. It's a question about what's true about the world and how we value each other's lives. So politics is messy. It can be unpleasant. It doesn't always result in everyone feeling we worked our way through to the truth and we found it. Sometimes it just resolves in a kind of detente or a compromise to put the issue on ice until we have a better way of dealing with it. But the truth matters a lot. And the best thing politics can do is force us to confront a rival truth claim that we otherwise might have let pass by. And when we're wrong, to submit to it and live a fuller life in the truth.
I'm sort of puzzling. That was fascinating, Leah, but I'm sort of puzzling over this idea that one of you and Lauren is wrong about Catholicism.
At least one.
At least one, right? So I'm Jewish. I'm not as learned as Ruth is. So I want to turn to you in a second, Ruth. But in my understanding of Judaism, there are multiple different interpretations, and there is not necessarily a single truth that can be gleaned from these teachings. And so I'm curious what you would say to that, Ruth, and sort of how you would look at this idea.
It's funny because I went to an Orthodox Jewish high school, and a rabbi I had for 2 years, who unfortunately recently passed away, was very right-wing Orthodox. And I remember him clearly in class one day saying, if you believe that what you believe is true, then what if another person believes differently, then you have to believe that they're wrong. And I think he was trying to help, forge our identity and think about the world, not necessarily in terms of black and white, but not just, I think, sort of enter into that sort of postmodern space of, everything for everyone, whatever. And then when I was in college, or shortly after college, I met an Orthodox rabbi who actually, I think, went to my high school, who wrote a book called "You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right," which was, of course, the exact opposite. And I think, to some extent, both are true. There are things that Judaism, where I always say, don't say Judaism says, because as you said, there is no Judaism. But that there are some things that are wrong, right? So to say, for example, that a fetus has no sanctity of life would be an incorrect statement from a Jewish perspective. However, there are rabbis who believe, and this is a major disagreement, especially as more recent as medical, processes for in utero medical care get better and better. We know more and more about what's going on in utero. That there are some rabbis who believe that if someone terminates a pregnancy, that is murder. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, therefore, that you never do it. But it does mean that it is killing someone. And then there's another perspective, and I think this one's become more dominant, that it's really just a part of the mother, and in that sense, it's causing some injury. And so you don't injure someone just for fun, but you can injure someone. I mean, Okay, these are broad terms. I don't want you to think, I mean, like you can walk up to someone and punch them. That's not what we're talking about. But it's seeing the pregnancy simply as an extension of the mother's body. And that then provides us two different frameworks for how to think about then abortion and how it's situated within that. And I want to answer the other question briefly about like faith and politics. I certainly see within the way I think about it is that when faith can inform the expansion of the rights of a group of people, I think faith should play a role in politics. When faith would limit the rights of a certain group of people, I think faith should stay out of politics, or at least religion, I guess you could say that distinction also. Because like I said earlier, I think that in that case, a religious community should have the humility to say that, you know, what I believe might be true for me, going back to that other question about black and white, but it's not my place to impose that on anybody else.
And I'll say I'm more skeptical of a fully rights-based framework, in part because there are conflicting rights claims and I don't believe all of them, right? Like the claim for abortion is that women have the right to not have a child when they choose not to. And then the claim that men can make is, don't I have a similar right, right? Like, don't I have the right to not be a father if I don't want to be? And our country actually states pretty definitively you do not have that right. You know, men who father a child have a responsibility to that child. It's a different responsibility of a different degree. All the state can extract is money. And it doesn't do a great job at doing that. But we have these conflicting questions of, does anyone, male or female, have an absolute right to say, when I give life to a child, I have the right to decline to be that child's parent and to walk away completely? And in some ways, abortion is an attempt to catch up to, you know, what's not been given to men as a right, but it's certainly something they find easier to do, to walk away from someone who depends on them, and to give women a way to catch up to do that too.
I actually just wanted to ask for 2 points of clarification, and this is for me. One, what I'm hearing you, at least in response to what I said, was that you do see religion and faith as synonymous, or maybe is that a mischaracterization?
I think, you know, the words are defined a lot of ways in different contexts. You know, faith is used both as like, which faith do you belong to, or what is your relationship to God? So I guess the question is, which sense are you asking me about?
So I mean, I'm just in a basic, like for me, when I tell people this is my faith belief, I espouse basic Christian views. When I say this is my religion, that's when I add sort of, this is what the Catholic Church teaches. And this is how it's layered on to my understanding of that. So I just.
Yeah, then I guess I see them as synonymous.
Okay, so that is one point of difference. I think another thing is that I have a very unique relationship with the Catholic Church, and that as a Black person, they do not have a really good track record with us. The church was very wrong on that. They have done enormous damage to Native and Indigenous populations. The church is very wrong for that. Their stance on women, they are very wrong on that. And so then when I look at the church's positions on other things, I already have in my head, this is the same church that's telling me that they're right on this issue when they have been so wrong on so many other things. And so when it comes to seeing then the Catholic Church as the ultimate truth, one, for me, that's almost a little bit heretical, because the church isn't the truth, God is the truth, and Jesus is the truth. The church is our intermediary between there. And so I guess, and I love this, we talked a bit about lunches then, like, what does that mean for who is right and who is wrong? And I, quite frankly, am perfectly okay with being the wrong person in this situation, because I'm going to have to square up with God regardless. So he's going to tell me if I'm right or wrong. And so I guess I'm wondering, and now I've discussed, but would love to continue talking about how you arrive to the truth, knowing that philosophers and theologians have been trying to find the truth for decades. But for me, like, being able to fully understand something is not attainable because we're not omnipresent, we're not God. So I think that that is also where some of that differs, is my, like, where I see the church and where I see God are completely different. And so the church can say something, God can say another. Also, the Catholic Health Association, interestingly enough, in the 90s, made it very clear that their position on abortion was that we will not force, like, we are practitioners, and in our, Catholic hospitals, we will not do this because this is our faith. However, we have no problem, or we will not punish or prevent other individuals who are operating literally and figuratively outside of our spectrum to do what they do. And so when I read that and I was like, oh, this is the 90s, I also felt like this is the Catholic Church saying kind of what you're saying is we have this position. Do not force us to do anything that's against our religious right. However, we recognize that not everyone has the same position. And so we are not in a position to then impose our beliefs writ large across an entire population of individuals. So that's kind of, yeah, sorry, that's just what you bubbled up in my ADHD brain.
I'm going to jump in here because I think we could spend a lot of time
know, and
just
I'm
debating
sorry.
how we can arrive at truth, but I wanted to actually go back to something that Ruth said about how faith should inform public policy and the difference between expanding rights or protecting rights. And I want to ask specifically about Dobbs and religious liberties and the extent to which you all think that Dobbs does or does not infringe on religious liberties. Yeah, I don't know whoever wants to start.
Yeah, so, yeah, I think that it created a big problem for Jewish communities. And in fact, actually, a couple of Jewish communities in different states have actually sued the government, saying that the content of the case is that by banning abortion, or at least if a state is banning abortion under certain circumstances, then it is actually prohibiting me as a Jew from being able to fulfill my religious, what's the word? It's not my obligation, right? But for me being able to practice my religion freely. Because as I said earlier, abortion is allowed in many circumstances under Jewish law, but it is also mandated at certain times. Because Jewish law always prioritizes the life of the mother. And so there you could conceivably have a situation where a woman would need to get an abortion from a Jewish perspective, and it would not be allowed from a legal perspective. So, you know, you could debate, well, whose legal rights, but certainly for the Jewish community, that is seen as an issue. And, you know, I think that even it was amazing to see, I think that even, as I mentioned earlier, parts of the more right-wing Orthodox community, there were some organizations that released statements championing this decision. You know, this is great, this is a victory for religion or whatever. I was like, what are you talking about? But also, there was a lot of naivety, I think, in what they were saying, because it was sort of, there was a side note of like, but in the case of the health of the mother, of course, you know, we still think abortion is you know, should be legal and all that stuff. And I think that there was, I was very concerned to see that, because I think that it takes for granted that different religious communities understand different pieces, just using different framework, right? And to me, that showed so clearly that the Jewish framework is one that still is existing within a Jewish space, and there isn't really enough cross conversation to really understand that. And I just a quick anecdote. I don't want to get into the details of the case. It's been discussed anonymously in different places before, but I have a good friend who needed a late-term abortion under very, very tragic, horrible circumstances. And this was before New York legalized them. And the rabbi who she was consulting with said, yes, it's okay, you can terminate this pregnancy, not even realizing that what he was recommending was actually illegal in the state in which they both lived. And to me, that was a very powerful story to share, because he very, very knowledgeable rabbi, you know, of a visibly Orthodox Jew. She's a visibly Orthodox Jew, and it wasn't the broader political context wasn't even fully understood. And I know that that's something that they've shared since then as an example. And so, you know, I think ultimately, just at the end of the day, I think this is part of a good conversation that we need to make sure. I've imagined that a lot of us are approaching it within the framework of what we know and not even fully understanding what other communities bring to the table.
I think one thing kind of in the framework of rights expansion, rights contraction, which, you know, isn't my primary framework, but working within yours, Dobbs is a rights contraction in some circumstances in that framework, but it's also a massive rights expansion for children who live whose rights are necessarily contracted in the world where it's legal to kill them.
Well, if you accept that framework.
Yes, but that is the claim, right? Like even from a rights, how can we help as many people express and enjoy their rights as possible? That there are a massive number of people, is the claim, who are not receiving their due rights, and that they're not absent from that equation. And I don't think we just kind of tally up the rights on all sides and put them together.
Right.
So I do want to kind of, I appreciate you giving a portrait of one of those hard cases. I'd like to give a kind of portrait to lay alongside it, because I think often when people talk about life of the mother exceptions, it's framed as though, you know, you're against abortion in all circumstances, and then you allow abortion in this circumstance. I'd like to paint a different portrait, just to give a contrasting view. When a mom develops eclampsia, let's say 36 weeks, there is no solution to help save her life except delivering the baby, because it's a disorder that stems from the placenta. And at 36 weeks, people expect the baby is probably going to live. Would it be better for the baby to keep developing in utero? Yes, if all things were equal. But it isn't, and there isn't a way to come to the mother's aid or to help her ride out eclampsia for very long. Maybe doctors say, we think we can wing you 12 hours. Do you want to spend 12 hours on meds and supervision so we can give a steroid shot to help your baby's lungs develop and give them a better shot? And many moms will say yes. And the doctors really have to stay in the room and be careful, because it's very dangerous.
So I
And no, do you mind if I just kind of give the full example? Yeah.
Sorry.
And no one frames that as an abortion, because you expect the baby's going to survive. You're delivering the baby early. You know you're harming the overall health of the baby, but you also know the mom can't go any further. Now, if a mom develops eclampsia at 18 weeks, you know you have to deliver the baby. You don't expect the baby's going to survive. And I'd say the contrast between this, between delivering a child when you don't expect the child to make it, but delivering them as a child, thinking of them as a person the whole time, versus an abortion at 18 weeks due to eclampsia or as an elective abortion, is that everyone in the room is rooting for the baby to live. You know, even though you know it's implausible, whether you're kind of right near that line or not, that an early delivery, you know, near the line of viability, before the line of viability, to save the mother's life, is a moment where ideally the doctor comes in and goes, look, we don't think you can make it any longer. You know, we have to deliver the baby to save your life. We could maybe get you 4 hours if we're, you know, waiting out meds, giving you antibiotics. Is there anyone you want to come to say goodbye to the baby with you? Having that same attentiveness to what it means to mourn a child there, and approaching it as mourning, not as your baby is trying to kill you, we're going to remove the tissue. And that's why I don't see life of the mother laws as laws about when do we allow abortion. I see them as analogous to when do we deliver a baby in the case of eclampsia at any time. And I see them as different because the question is, how do we care for the mother as a mother? How do we do everything possible for the baby? And then if the baby is delivered and dies, how do we respond to the dignity of that child appropriately? And I'll say one last thing here, which is there's a ministry by the Trappists of New Melleray Abbey to give coffins to parents who lose a child. They build coffins to support their life and community, but they send them to free for parents who lose a child. And what they found is often the parents who call after a stillbirth, after a miscarriage, you know, what the hospital gave them was a trash bag. That parents who lost a child before viability, a wanted child, not an abortion, just a miscarriage, the hospital said, oh, we know what this is. This is tissue. This is trash. And then the monks would send them a coffin. And when the hospital knew that was an option, the nurses would start asking and making the call. And that's the kind of shift I want to see.
I just want to jump in for a second. I mean, you're sharing a really powerful perspective here, Leah. And I just sort of want to share with my researcher and anthropologist hat on that I think, you know, it's a powerful ideal. The problem is that what happens in trying to operationalize this is that the laws inhibit physicians from at times offering that care before it's too late or before, you know, the mother has already suffered irrevocably.
I think that's a feature of the fact that our doctors don't treat mothers with respect when they're delivering babies with no complications, right? That's not a problem that's unique to abortion. You know, Serena Williams shouldn't have had to climb off her hospital bed to re-explain her medical conditions to her doctors after birth and save her own life by advocating for an MRI, That wasn't a question about abortion. That was a question about treating women along with babies like trash, and particularly treating vulnerable women like trash. So I do agree, it's hard to go in with trust to a medical system that looks at women who are vulnerable when they're in labor, when they're pregnant, and doesn't listen to them or be attentive to their health, particularly women who are poor, women who are non-white. But that problem isn't unique to abortion. It's something I want to fight on every front, but I don't want to shortchange the babies while I'm advocating for the moms too.
So when I would say that, just to go back to the original question, I think that Dobbs was a huge infringement on religious liberties, point blank period. Because again, you're taking a very narrow understanding of Christian thought and applying it to an entire country. That to me is just not right. It's not acceptable. And I think what was very hard for me, in addition to my office being down the street from the Supreme Court when that decision was made, was being on the phone with colleagues from organizations like Catholics for Choice, National Council for Jewish Women, Muslim Health Association, and the impact, emotional impact that that had on them, and just feeling like, once again, our beliefs, the things that we bring to the country, the ways in which we live, are not being recognized or respected by a body who is, again, trying to make this country into a white Christian nation. And I think also, what for me has been really problematic is the assumption that a lot of people are coming from a really good place like you are when it comes to abortion. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Herbert Gans in 1972 wrote a really fascinating article that's still topical. It's called The 15 Functions of Poverty. And I remember it was on my syllabus and it absolutely pissed me off because I was like, how can poverty serve any function ever? And in this article, he discusses how capitalism, in order for capitalism to survive, you need a body of individuals who are constantly poor, who will constantly work low labor jobs and will essentially help feed the upper echelons of society. And he even went in on social workers, right? Social workers, to a certain extent, we do perpetuate a lot of the same systems that continue to impoverish people and oppress people and prevent them from being their true self. So everyone went unscathed. And I'm going to be very honest here, is that there are some people that I have talked to, whether they're policymakers or individuals who honestly believe that banning abortion helps to serve that capitalist function of ensuring that you have a group of children who are born into families that may not have the resources needed to help them survive. And they're not voting to ensure that those resources are there to help them to survive. And so they know that if this child is born in this situation, or if this mother has health complications, if this or this happens, then this is the outcome of the child, and good. Now we have that. And so for me, I think that's also part of, I guess, going back to what I really want people to decouple this notion, is that not everyone is coming from, at the abortion, from a really fuzzy place. The systems that we have need to be perpetuated by individuals, and those individuals are there. And so I think that that's also something, a hard truth that some people really need to swallow, is that some people want kids to be born destitute because people need those people to fill jobs that they'll never do. It's a really hard fact. It's really, from a faith perspective, it's very hard to swallow, because how could you ever treat a human being that way? But that's the reality of the situation. And so I think that is part of the problem here, is that we're assuming that everyone really is coming at it from a place of care for the child, because a lot of people who say that they're pro-life are not pro-life course, and they stop caring once the baby is there, and they are actively doing things like cutting SNAP, trying to make it difficult to access Medicaid, making sure that there are no, family planning resources for women who may know that they have high-risk pregnancies, to ensure that they don't have to deliver early. And so I think that that is, it's a religious liberty issue, even for Christians in and of itself, because it's saying this is the Christian thought on this, and this is how this country is going to operate. And that's just not the case. It also takes, again, a very deontological approach to an issue that has teleological aspects of it. It's, you either do this, it's either black or white. Deontology is, there's a right and a wrong. Teleological, so for example, someone steals, that's wrong. You go to jail, you're a thief. You're not supposed to steal. Someone is stealing diapers and formula for their child because the US government refuses to expand the child tax credit. refuses to ensure that people have adequate housing, refuses to ensure that people are making a living wage. And so in order to keep this baby that they now have, that they are unable to support because the child has needs and they did not really have the resources they needed or the supports, regardless of socioeconomic strata, like, how is that being pro-life? Like, how is that protecting a child? Because you know, the more that they're exposed to these things, the outcomes are going to be bad. And that's not a life that anyone should lead. And so I think really what we would do better as a country is if we focused, and this is what Pope John Paul said, is if we recognize the fact that life through all subsequent stages, conception to death, is sacred. And until we as a country actually act like that, we cannot say that we have a religious Christian perspective on things, because we're not following the religious Christian understanding of the sanctity of life from birth to death, from conception to death. And so that's kind of what I just wanted to add in that piece, and to answer that original question, and just also honor the fact that you and I have very differing views, but I really get the sense and I understand that your passion is for the actual child. And I appreciate that. And I genuinely wish that there were more people that had that same passion, because our current system for maternal, newborn, and childcare would be completely different.
There we strongly agree.
Right? And that's, you're more pro-life course than pro-life. And I appreciate that. And I think that that is also a huge distinction that we need to start making in this country.
This is great. And unfortunately, we're sort of coming to the end of our time. I don't want to dip into the Q&A time too much, because I know we have a lot of good questions lined up. So I want to ask, sort of by way of closing, if you could reflect a little bit on what people of faith should be doing in this critical moment to support women and pregnant people. And maybe we'll start with Ruth.
Well, yes, I agree with everything you said. I believe that people of faith should always be involved in supporting other humans and justice causes, and causes that, as you said, respect more life. I also don't want people of faith to sort of operate under, I think it's sometimes people who have an idealistic, we all do this over different things, but you have like an idealistic perspective on something and say, well, you know, yeah, because we should absolutely, you know, never allow abortion because every child should be cared for completely by the state and by the government. I'm the sort of the cynic, I guess, who pushes back. My friend once said that's my job, is to kind of look at things and poke holes in it, and says, okay, but we don't live in that ideal world yet. And so what role faith has, I mean, I think faith should always be involved in justice causes, but I think faith should also advocate for the vulnerable. And I think we probably have extremely different definitions of who the vulnerable are in those cases. And I think ensure, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that faith members, to me, most importantly, should keep themselves in check, frankly. Yeah.
So from an advocacy standpoint, join Sojourners advocacy so we can do this together. I'm just kidding. That was horrible, but my job really would love me to plug our Faith Rooted Advocates Network. But I think just be engaged. Like, be curious. Do this. Have these debates. Have these discussions. And also try to understand that your lived experience, especially if you're a male, is going to be vastly different than the lived experience of a woman, which is also going to be vastly different than the experience of a Black woman, of a Native woman, of a Hispanic woman, of a Latina woman. I think that people of faith, what they really need to be doing right now is, because Dobbs has decided, there's like, you know, we certainly have legislation, but it's not going to pass in probably the next 5 to 10 years based on the current makeup. So we really need to be focusing again on shoring up our maternal, newborn, and childcare systems. Now that abortion is, you know, not the law of the land, at least federally, and it's really truly become a states' rights issue, how are you pushing your states? How are you getting involved in your state and local governments and your national governments to look at maternal care? If anyone is in Mississippi or Alabama, y'all need to be emailing, y'all need to be calling your members and asking, why have you not expanded Medicaid in my state? And there are rural hospitals that are closing, which is undoubtedly going to kill a bunch of children. So don't sit here and tell me that you're pro-life if you're not willing to create the systems that are actually going to create life in there. And so the extent to which we can then, again, follow, or at least really honor that first 0 to 3 and create systems of care that are going to do that, that's great. I would also really get engaged in the current debate right now, because we are facing massive cuts to programs that individuals rely on. SNAP, Medicaid. We don't even have paid family leave, right? To the extent to which you guys can, again, lobby your state and local legislators, your national members of Congress, and say, okay, bet, we don't have Dobbs, this is what we need, is going to be incredibly effective. And you speak to it from a faith space. Be like, if you want to talk about honoring life, if you want to be about it, then do it. Don't, again, Serena Williams, the fact that she was almost died because of inadequate care, and she had to advocate herself. And there's a lot of racial undertones in that, because our medical apartheid system is very dangerous for Black and brown people. Like, that should not be a thing. And so pay attention to what is actually happening with women. Also understand that as a woman or as a primary caregiver, that 0 to 3 child is entirely dependent on you. So stop assuming that it's just childcare and maternal care, and think about, again, the continuum of care between the person, and create those systems and demand those systems for individuals. So that way, again, if we want to talk about being pro-life, then we actually are a pro-life country, regardless of faith belief.
I really like that last point, because of course a child isn't viable when it's born. Nothing magically happens, and they're incredibly dependent on their family. They can't survive, they can't eat, they can't
talk.
they can't advocate for themselves. Like, you know, a child is no less connected to their mother and father after they're born than they were before, and they require an intense outpouring support during pregnancy and afterwards because of that dependency and need. On the policy level, I'm pro direct, universal, unconditional cash transfers to parents, with as few bureaucratic hurdles as possible, because the more kind of barriers you put up to qualify, the more the people who are neediest are the ones who can't get over them. And the people like me who have the leisure time and the privilege to get over them are the ones who get the benefits. On the interpersonal level, I think it's hard to build a society that responds with love to the needs of others when we're ashamed of being needy. So one thing I try and do is that when I'm with someone else, who's a Christian, or someone else who's religious of any other faith who I think would be open to it, is I try not to part from the friend without asking, and is there anything I can pray for you? And it's really surprising. I can spend an hour with a friend talking about our lives and only hear the thing that's most important to them at the end when I ask, because we're ashamed of telling people things we struggle with that we think they can't help with. And it's only when the door is open to prayer that we say, well, actually, my mom's going in for a second mammogram and I don't know what's going to happen, or, I'm failing this class, or I'm afraid of something. And it's because we kind of know it can be turned over to God, we're able to bring it to our friend. And I'd really encourage you to share something that you need, that you're a little ashamed of needing, with someone, because we have a culture that doesn't trust need, that despises the needy, that's afraid of having someone depend on us if we can't support them, and therefore wants them to go away. And, I'm just saying, the Times a few weeks ago, there was a story about a man whose wife was in hospice care, and he's out in California during the big snows, and he couldn't dig out of his driveway, and he visited her every day till the snows. And he spent 2 days digging till his hands bled before he posted to ask for help for anyone else to dig him out. And when he did, he said he was ashamed that he had to ask. We can't have a culture that values babies if we have a culture where men think that by asking for help to see their dying wife, they've revealed that they're not a man, or that there's something wrong with them. And that kind of testimony comes person to person, revealing your own need and seeing that as making you more connected to your friend, rather than a bad friend to them, any more than a child is a bad child for needing something of their mother.
Wow, thank you all so much. I just learned so much from the three of you, and I'm sure the audience did as well. I think we have some questions queued up.
Yes, we have quite a few questions. This is from somebody in the room. This person wants to know, for all of the panelists, when do you think life begins?
Who did it? Who did it? Who did it? They're like, they're getting along too well. So I guess I'll take it, because this is actually a complicated question, because I see life there's a scientific explanation, and then for me, there's a spiritual explanation. I actually happen, even though, I mean, I guess you would brand me pro-choice, and I need to make it clear that that is not necessarily the position of my organization. What I have said is all Lauren and only Lauren, so don't get me fired. I honestly think that life begins at conception. From a spiritual perspective, because boom, God has created this moment and he has planned this person to be alive. And so this has happened, life is there. From a scientific perspective, I understand that there is some distinction between a zygote and an actual fetus. However, for me, once, now I'm gonna get technical, once the egg and the sperm come together and they form this new mass of cells, this is a living cell body. It might not necessarily be a life, but it is a living cell body. And so this for me is very complicated when you talk about abortion, because I don't want to use the term murder, but you are ending a life, right? And so that I realize that it's a bit complicated, and I'm sure people can be like, you are talking crazy, but that is just my very own personal position that I've made based on my own sort of research. And yeah.
This is where we're more in sync. I'm also going to say at conception, it's the first moment when the child is distinct, a distinct person, not a part of the mother and the father as they were as an egg in a particular sperm cell. And one thing that I found pretty powerful is I'd heard a lot of pro-life arguments while I was pro-choice that kind of were framed through, well, when does the child look like a person? Is it when the baby goes from having kind of flipper hands to distinct fingers? Is it when the child can hear? Is it a certain capacity? And I heard someone else make a different argument, which is, at 6 weeks, at 8 weeks, it's not that the child has gotten closer to looking human. That's what a human looks like at 6 weeks old. That's what a human looks like at 8 weeks old. At some point, as we wrap up, my daughter's going to come back who's 1 year old. She looks different than me. She has capacities that are different than mine. And she's not getting close enough to be human to be rounded up. She looks like what a 1 year old looks like. And a zygote looks like what a person looks like when they're a zygote's age.
So it's funny because on the one hand, I agree, life begins at conception. I have two caveats to that. The first is, well, what's being conceived? I mean, we've talked a little bit about this. We were maybe going to share. I've conceived 4 pregnancies that resulted in miscarriage, and were never viable. We tested one of them. It was a whole gobbledygook of chromosomes. As a disaster, right? But I was pregnant for a couple of weeks. Well, was it alive? I mean, I don't think so. It was just going through an automatic process of cell division until my body accurately said, this isn't going anywhere, and did the pregnancy. Was that life? No, I don't think so. That's certainly not how I think of it. And I think that one thing we have to be so careful about is we've gone to equate a pregnancy with life. And I think women who have miscarried, especially those of us repeatedly, like, it's just not true. I mean, I've been pregnant many times where I just roll my eyes. I'm like, okay, waiting for this one, like in a month, it'll be done. Don't worry. There's more to talk about there. But like, so I think it's very problematic. I think also the distinction, however, that is required for a Jewish perspective is it's not a question just about life, but about life that is equal to human life, especially in comparison to the mother. So I'll give an example. There's a Mishnah, which is a text that's 2,000 years old, that says if a woman is in labor and struggling and her life is at risk, you can go in, I mean, whether or not this is realistic is a different story, but a lot of their discussions were more hypothetical, theoretical, let's say, and chop up the baby limb by limb and remove it in order to save her life. However, once that baby's head has emerged from her, then even if it's just the head, or some say the majority of the body, then all bets are off. They're both equal life at that point. Now, you could argue, well, what if that's a matter of an hour? And of course, in modern day, there's no real distinction because of course we can just, have emergency C-sections and what have you. But I think what the rabbis here are really trying to tease out is that they weren't really sure exactly when an embryo, a fetus, becomes a independent human being. And so I think that, so this whole, the oversimplification of when does life begin, life begins at conception if it's a healthy fetus, it's a healthy set of genes. However, it is not, from at least a Jewish perspective, a human life on equivalent, on the same level of holiness and dignity as a pre-existing human until it can prove, until it emerges into the actual physical world. And I pity the soul of the person who has to argue that in court, but because that's complicated, but I think that's important.
But I think you have an ally on that on Peter Singer, right? Because his argument is until a person can prove that they're independent, healthy,
Yes.
can develop, they don't have the presumption of dignity. And that's why he argues that it should be legal for parents to kill their children up to 4 months after birth if they're disabled.
Mhm.
Because his argument is that there isn't that proof, right?
Yeah,
That
there you go.
that if we judge human life by that proof of worth, that's not a given and it shouldn't be a given after birth. So how do you kind of weigh that kind of argument from him?
Well, I would have to think about that a lot more.
Let's try to get a few more questions in here before we spend the whole time on this.
To the points of clash in the abortion debate reveal the limits of pluralist democracy. At the end of the day, don't we need a firm line on whether abortion is murder or not? And I think I take that as asking, we can have a civil disagreement, but at the end of the day, policy needs to be made and somebody's going to lose. And can people get along with each other afterward?
Yes, we do, right? Because the stakes are high. And because the thing that I've kind of come to believe on both sides is that people are mostly arguing in good faith and trying to defend someone whose worth they think is threatened. And if I'm wrong about what a baby is, then you should stop me, right? Because then I'm endangering people who are actual people for the sake of people who aren't. And if you're wrong about who people are, then I should stop you because you're endangering people who are actually people and lying to their parents about who their children are and the stakes of their decision they're making. This isn't an easy difference to live alongside each other in a pluralistic society. When you do the polls, is there probably national support for a ban after the first trimester with certain exceptions? Yes. Would anyone be very happy with that, even if you could cobble together a coalition? No. This is something where we have to really work through the specific philosophical questions till we can conquer each other by both submitting to the truth. There's an early Christian martyr who talks about his gratitude for having been defeated in debate, because it's by being conquered that he is the victor. And it's only by coming to know and live in the truth, whichever it is and whichever of us needs to lose, that we can live a full human life. And I think what I really trust among everyone in this panel is that everyone here has a real heart for the vulnerable. And the way I feel about like my previous donations to Planned Parenthood is that I made a wrong choice, right? I did something with good intentions that hurt people. And I'm grateful for folks who tried to stop me.
From a purely political science standpoint, I think that the current debate on abortion is exactly the function of what a pluralist democracy is. Like, so what we're doing here is like, I don't want to say like it was all designed, but like this is exactly how it's supposed to work out. And I think that in the case of abortion, because we're not just talking about, an allocation of resources or programs, we're again talking about people's lives. It's going to be a lot sticky. I quite frankly, I don't know if we as a country will ever come to a general consensus on this, because again, as we've shown, views are so different. However, I will say that I think that if we are a society, are going to be a society where abortion is a reality, that there should be at least some restrictions, and not to prevent abortion, but to ensure that the health of the mother and the child is always protected, and that medically the procedures are ethical, and that people are not, that's a good one. But I think for me, it's just kind of a function of our democracy. Would I love the law to be different right now? Yes, but it's part of the game, right? And I think every time a law is overturned or every time changes in society are made, some people see that as a step back, but I think almost to yours, you can take 2 steps back and 10 steps forward. And I think what we're doing now is going back to some of these similar debates and having the same discussions that folks were having when Roe was decided. And I think we're trying to understand as a country what it means to value life and then what that then means in policy. And so I think that this is just a natural inflection point in pluralist democracy. It's a function of it. And I think it's how it continues to perpetuate, because we're consistently talking about ideas and consistently ensuring that no one super majority or no one minority group is making choices for the majority.
All right. The church has throughout its history focused on charity. It views the poor and the marginalized as just as human as the well-off. Does it line up with this aspect of church teaching to end the life of a human just because it may be a difficult life? I think this question is getting at abortion in cases of financial difficulty. If Christianity values the poor, then is it right to end a life just because it might be poor?
Yeah, no, that's, and I guess maybe I'm feeling a bit of transference because I feel like I may have misstated something. I do not believe. Actually, I'm gonna take a breath. Does anyone else want to answer that one?
My answer is kind of
Yeah.
obvious to the room.
Yeah.
So.
I'm not Christian. I don't know. Yeah, that's a hard one. That's a tough one. Do you mind actually repeating that?
The question is if the church has a history of being focused on charity and
Right.
valuing the poor, is it right to end a life or to terminate a pregnancy just because of financial difficulty?
Yeah. No, and that's just my personal opinion. No. You should not, I mean, and that is where, again, why are people being put in a position to make that choice? So that it takes away from, oh, these people are doing this because they just don't want a baby and they're irresponsible, to what are all of the factors that are going into that. And that is, again, gets to the fact that making that choice about pregnancy and your reproductive health and abortion is a very individual, personal choice that's contextual and situational. And so, but no, you should not abort a child because you don't have the resources. And as a society, we should do better so that way people aren't put in that position.
All right, this is from somebody on Zoom. The question is, should men get a vote on abortion, or maybe should men be part of the discussion? Maybe,
They
maybe that's
are.
on us for how we compose the panel.
They already are. Yeah.
I think they shouldn't get a vote on it because it shouldn't happen, right? But I think there's a real danger for men specifically. We talk about why is this a men's issue as well as a women's issue, aside from the fact that some babies are men. I think it's a real tragedy that men who, have passing relationships, including in college, right? Including, on this campus, will father children without knowing that they're fathers, and will maybe learn later in life that they lost a child without ever knowing that child while they were alive.
I think men dominate the debate already. I mean, look at the makeup of Congress, look at the makeup of our Supreme Court. The decision was largely made by older white males who will never get pregnant, who have probably gotten someone pregnant and told them to not have that baby as well. That definitely happens because some of the loudest pro-life voices in at least high school when we were having this debate would also then talk about all the abortions that they'd had. So, I think in this debate, we should lean more on women because it is our lived experience. And so when it comes to defining a problem and finding the solutions, it's best to look to the people with that actual lived experience. And I think the debate is it's very clearly about males because we don't even talk about how much pregnancy is actually a trauma to the body. And we talk about that in global health. We say labor, delivery, and pregnancy is a trauma to the body. People make pregnancy out to be like this great thing, and it is amazing, but your organs are shifting up, things are changing. People have broken hips in the middle of delivery. People have permanent disabilities because of delivery. And so I think you're not going to ever get that perspective if you don't ever have to go through that. And I'm, quite frankly, I'm probably not even qualified because to my knowledge, I've never been pregnant and I certainly have never given birth. So there's limitations on my ability to put input because I would put those who have children, who have gone through that experience before my own, as really sort of the test case as to what should be happening.
I think everybody should be part of the debate. I don't see this as being exclusively a women's issue at all. And I think that everyone needs to just be informed. I've seen plenty of men, and I'm sure women, toss around terms like, I don't know, late term abortion or this or that they don't even know what they mean or what they're talking about. And just make all the kinds of just like ridiculous assumptions. But I don't think that like, if you're a woman, you're automatically like know how to talk about it. If you're a man, you automatically are not. To me, that's just more of an issue of hopefully generational male entitlement of knowledge.
Okay, well, we have a hard question at the end. This is from a Zoom panelist. They were curious what the panel thinks about abortion in the case of pregnancies resulting from rape.
I can start that one if you'd like. Okay, yeah. So like I said earlier, what's become, I think, more of the dominant line of thinking within Jewish law is that if it is for the sake of the health of the mother, abortion is permissible, not required, right? That would be like, well, I'll get to that in a second. Required would be like a more tangible thing. And I think we tend to associate more tangible health threats with physical health as opposed to mental health. Also, hopefully one day that will change, but for now, that's where we are. But the definition of the woman's health is pretty expansive, does include physical health and also does include mental health. I'm sure there are rabbis out there who would say that in the case of rape, a woman should not terminate, but I believe and know that there are many who would. And that's certainly something I would support.
I have been raped twice in high school, actually after high school. I would have loved to at least have had the choice to make the decision. Because the thought of carrying my rapist child is unbearable. It's unbearable. And not only that, I don't think people really think about what that does to a child to process that is your origin story. And not only that, what does that do to that child, but what does that do to family members? I know someone who's very close to me whose mother was raped when she was 15 and it resulted in a pregnancy. Typical Catholic household in the 70s anyway, so Roe was a little murky, so she had the baby. Her as a 15-year-old, like just being pregnant in a conservative household was hell in and of itself. And then she had the child. And having that child was she never stopped being a mom, even though she gave the child up for adoption. And then you think about the other children that she had and how that knowledge, what that knowledge has done to them. And then knowing that they have a sibling out there that they may or may not ever meet. And there's a hesitancy to even reach out to that sibling because what if that person does not know? So then that person's life is impacted because they may want to know someone, but they can't. And then there's also just that there's just so much. I think women should have that choice, regardless of what I think. Because it's carrying something for a child for 10 months and it's constant knowledge. God forbid any of you all have ever been raped. Those memories don't go away. They don't stop. And they're bodily. Have you ever heard of trauma keeps the score? There are moments sometimes when I'm in certain situations where I may have a flashback. I am 38. This happened when I was 18. You have to think about what you are doing to people, not just physically, but psychologically, emotionally. And you have to understand that it's not just a choice for them. It's a choice that impacts their families. It impacts any children that they may have. It impacts future generations. And so, yes, in that moment, should a woman have the right to choose for herself and for other people? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because she didn't have a choice when the incident happened to her. So damn it, give her some agency over her body in this moment. And give her the opportunity to feel like she has everything that she needs to survive and thrive after this. Because I will tell you, just because you have an abortion doesn't mean that you're a heartless person. That will also live and stick with you forever. Because every year, and I'm not saying this is I've never had an abortion myself, but every year when you talk to women, there are women that still have birthdays for their child. It doesn't mean that they never wanted the child. It just means that their circumstances were too great for me to understand in my seat. And so they made that choice for themselves. So absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yes. 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 Why would you condemn a woman to carry a child from someone who forced themselves on? Why? Why? And why would you want that child to live with that knowledge of this is how I came to be? Do you understand the psychological damage that can do to someone? They can have all the thriving and all the amazing life, but that one thing is going to be in their head. And God forbid then they ever find their father. Think about that. Like, life is not black and white. Life is complex. People make hard decisions every day. Abortion is a hard decision. So in that case, why would you make someone's life even harder than it has to be? Give them the option to have a choice. A choice. Yeah, sorry. I just learned how to cry in therapy. I didn't do it for a long time. So now the waterworks are like whoosh.
Can you teach me next time?
I really appreciate you making the gift of telling us that when that's a really hard thing. And I'm so sorry. I think, in a world where we believe a baby is a child, where people believe that very strongly, it's a less compelling choice in the case of rape. And I'll give an example of a different way of experiencing it. But, I think this is a case where the law is hardest. And where part of the question is, what does it take to person have a conversation about the baby and the choice, and what kind of remedy is possible after such? Because I think what you're absolutely right on is it is an ongoing hardship, right? To know intimately that you're connected to that person, not just in the moment, but through the child. What I'll give is a world that might be, in the world I prefer is the one where people don't commit sexual assault at all, obviously. But Amy Murphy, who leads Rehumanize International, conceived a child through rape. And her rapist threatened her and said, if you don't get rid of that, I'll kill you. And she said that was the moment she'd been trying to weigh what she wanted, right? Like, where she just thought, I don't want my body to be a site of violence anymore. And I can't go back and stop that one. But I do have the power to stop this one. And even if he hurt me, then I'd be different from him. And I would have taken a chance for this child. And I don't expect that's a universally compelling pitch, right? But I think the question is, where can we make a turn away from violence? And where can we make it possible to heal and to meet people in their need after they've experienced severe violence?
Is that it, Nora?
Do we want to do one more question, like just to wrap it up, or?
Up to you.
How about one final question?
If it's
Is
like,
there-
what's your favorite food, then I'd totally like that. We're just.
If there's only one way to interpret faith, how will we ever know what is the right way to think about abortion? Like, how do you know if you were right about this decision? Can we know?
No. I think that this is also where it gets complicated, because I believe that Jesus is Savior. I believe that God is God. Very clear, but I also concede I could die and all of this could just be absolutely bull. And I think that that is probably not a position a lot of people have. But it's just like, yeah, there's no, like, it's just all like, everything that I could believe in, like, I could die and the flying spaghetti monster could be real. And I was totally wrong on that. But I think that's also just goes to the way in which I was taught. I remember Father Tucker, when I was in my catechism class, said, if you look around, there's all different kinds of people. There's Hindus, there's Buddhists, there's Jewish people, there's Muslims, there's atheists. And don't you think in God's infinite wisdom that none of that is an accident? Who are you to say that all of these other individuals were created or weren't created for a reason? And when he said that, I was like, oh, one, you're going to get transferred out of this parish so quickly, bro. And he was. But Father Tucker was not there next week. But that for me, Father Tucker, wherever you are, I loved you. You were awesome. But I think that for me was really transformational because it changed my view that there is one right faith or one right religion, and opened me up to believe that maybe God is working through others for reasons that I'll never understand, because I can't even get up out of bed on time. So who am I to understand God? So I think that that's also informs my position on abortion, is because I realize that, again, I have these very strong faith beliefs, but I could be wrong. And I also realize that God has created diversity for a reason. So who am I to say that your faith beliefs are wrong when God made you that way?
I often see this as analogous to the other transcendent source of truth outside religion, which is, of course, mathematics. There are questions in mathematics that we don't have settled at the moment, which doesn't mean that it's not the case already before or not we construct the proof that the Riemann hypothesis either is or is not true. What we don't have yet is our bridge to find out, like from here, from what we know now, how will we figure out what is true? So we can be uncertain or divided from each other, but what's true is true without our knowing it or having reached it yet. It's what we're building towards. And then for the question of how do we sort out what's true when we feel conflict within ourselves or when we have conflict with others, I think one of the best things to do is to find a friend who you disagree with, but you trust in their good faith, and read and talk together and go back to your own sources. And I think what's also helpful is to kind of translate back and forth from, the specific case you're fighting over, and look at other kind of related questions and keep sifting as though you're going, okay, well, if we change it this way, does that flip what you think? Okay, well, I care about the vulnerable in this way, but not here. Okay, well, I don't. How do I reconcile these two things? And for me, that's a large part of what informs my understanding here, because I look around at the way we respond to vulnerability, weakness, lack of capacity, and I see allies in many places on the pro-choice side who look at pressure for euthanasia for the disabled, who look at shoddy care in nursing homes for the elderly, who speak up for women because women are disabled by pregnancy, just like you were saying. And I say, well, look, like we're very close to agreement in some ways, and we've got to push a little harder on what makes this case different. Which of us is wrong? Is the vulnerability of a baby like the vulnerability of someone who's elderly, or is it different? Is, just taking away or ending the life of someone whose quality of life you're not sure of merciful or eugenicist? Let's push on these examples both in our present day, and I guess my actual piece of advice is it's really helpful to read outside your time. It's helpful to read debates from outside your time and see kind of how people have handled these questions at a lot of different times. It can help you get out of a rut where you're going through the same arguments again and again, moment by moment with a friend now, and you can start to have a different argument and jog something loose. And to read outside your time on this issue, I'd recommend Defenders of the Unborn, A History of the Pro-Life Movement Before Roe, because I think it kind of scrambles the sides in many ways of people who we'd expect if they were born today would take a different perspective than they did then. And it's a good place to start a conversation about how did each of us end up on opposite sides now.
So I think that's a good place to, sorry, Ruth, final words, final quick words.
Okay, very quick. So I think that as the only way in this country that I'm a minority is religious. And because I have white skin privilege and socioeconomic privilege, I think that the events of the past year have really made me feel in the first time in this country that I could not be safe I don't mean safe, like, you know, walk outside, but safe, like go to a hospital, and not be able to be cared for in a way that would save my life. And that to me is an indicator of a society that's doing something wrong. The end.
I want to thank all of our panelists for your candor this evening. It's been a really wonderful discussion. I really appreciate everything that you've shared. I have a couple of quick announcements before we close. I want to let you know that a recording of tonight's event will be made available on the PPD YouTube channel in the next few days. So look there if you'd like to catch it. And if you have an unused note card, please give it to a staff member on your way out. Finally, there will be pizza for students on the patio.
That's why
Please
you're
join
here.
us.